Maggie Calloway slammed both palms on the mercantile counter so hard the glass jars rattled. Her voice didn't shake. Not in front of her boys. Not in front of this town. "My children haven't eaten in 2 days," she said. 2 days. And not one person in this room has the decency to look me in the eye. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound was little Rose pressing her face into her mother's skirt and crying without making a sound. If this story touches your heart, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The morning Maggie Calloway walked into Deaver's Mercantile, she had exactly 43 cents in her coat pocket, 3 hungry children at her heels, and what was left of her pride, wrapped so tight around her chest she could barely breathe. She hadn't slept. She'd been up since before the roosters, sitting at the kitchen table counting coins. She'd already counted 4 times, hoping the number would change. It never did. Nathan walked behind her like a soldier 12 years old, and already carrying the face of a man who'd been disappointed too many times. Wesley held Rose's hand, pulling her along gently when her small legs slowed. Rose hadn't spoken a full sentence in 3 weeks, not since the last time she'd asked when Papa was coming home, and nobody had been able to answer her. The mercantile smelled like tobacco and sawdust, and the kind of warmth that comes from people who don't have to worry about going cold. Maggie stood at the counter and waited for Gerald Deaver to look up from his ledger. He didn't. She cleared her throat. "Mr. Deaver?" He turned a page. "Mr. Deaver." Her voice was steady. She'd practiced steadiness. She'd practiced it the way other women practiced piano every morning in the mirror before the children woke up. "I need flour salt and a half-pound of dried beans. I have 43 cents. I'm asking for the remainder on credit until spring. My kitchen garden will be up by April, and I'll have eggs to trade by." No credit. He didn't look up. "I have 3 children. Lots of folks got children. Mine haven't eaten a proper meal since Tuesday." He closed the ledger then, folded his hands on top of it, looked at her the way a man looks at something he's already decided isn't his problem. "Maggie Calloway," he said loud enough for the 2 women browsing near the fabric bolts to hear, "your husband left this store owing me $4.60. I don't extend credit to families that don't pay their debts. Thomas is dead. And the debt died with him." The women by the fabric bolts had gone still, listening. Maggie kept her chin level. "I am not Thomas. I am asking for $2 of flour and beans on account of my name, not his." Deaver leaned back in his chair. "Your name is his name, Mrs. Calloway. That's how it works." One of the women near the bolts, Edna Marsh, wife of the town alderman, let out a small sound. Not quite a laugh. Something worse than a laugh. Maggie's hands pressed flat against the counter. She could feel Nathan behind her go rigid. She could feel Wesley pulling Rose closer. "Please," she said quietly. Just once. Just the one word, because it was all she had left. "Move along," Deaver said. "You're holding up the counter." That was when Maggie's palms hit the wood. The jars rattled. A tin of coffee teetered on the shelf behind him. Deaver startled back in his chair. "My children haven't eaten in 2 days." Her voice came out low and flat and terrible with calm. 2 days. And not one person in this room has the decency to look me in the eye. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she'd ever heard. Edna Marsh set down the bolt of calico she'd been holding. "Well," she said to no one in particular and everyone at once, "I suppose we see what kind of woman she really is." "The kind who feeds her children," Maggie said. She looked directly at Edna when she said it. Edna's mouth thinned to a line. Deaver was on his feet now. "You'll leave this store, or I'll send for the sheriff." "For what?" "Asking for flour." "For making a scene. For disturbing the peace." He came around the counter, and he was a large man, big through the shoulders, and he used that size the way men like him always did, Not violently, just presently filling up the space between her and the door. Your husband was a drunk and a gambler, and he left you nothing but trouble. That ain't the town's fault. Now go on. Nathan stepped forward. Just one step. 12 years old, shoulders barely past the counter, and he stepped forward. Don't talk about my father like that, he said. His voice cracked on the last word. The boy cracked the one that happened when a young man's voice was still deciding what it wanted to be. It made the words sound more desperate than defiant, and Maggie watched Deaver's lip curl slightly at the sound of it. Boy, Deaver said, you best teach yourself some manners before... He's 12 years old. Maggie moved between them. Her hand found Nathan's arm, her fingers closing around it once a message, a thank you. A please step back, all wrapped into one grip. He's 12 years old and he's defending his mother's name. You ought to be ashamed. Nobody in the room looked ashamed. They walked out. Maggie pushed through the door, first held it for her children, and didn't let herself feel anything until they were halfway down the main road, and she was sure no one in the Mercantile could see her face anymore. Rose looked up at her. Mama, are we bad? No, sweetheart. Maggie's voice didn't waver. 30 more seconds, she told herself. Get around the corner. We are not bad. Then why? We are not bad, she said again. Firmer, and Rose went quiet. They turned the corner past the post office, and Maggie stopped walking. She pressed one hand against the building's plank wall and breathed. In, out, in. The kind of breathing that wasn't really breathing, just the mechanical movement of a chest that wasn't ready to give up yet. Nathan stood beside her. He didn't say anything. He was learning not to say anything in these moments, which broke her heart more than if he'd cried. Wesley was the one who spoke. What are we going to do, Mama? I'm going to think, she said. For how long? Wesley. Because it's cold, and Rose is hungry, and I'm hungry too, and I don't... Wesley. Softer now. She turned and looked at him, at his 8-year-old face, with its 8-year-old honesty that hadn't yet learned to protect itself with silence. She crouched down in front of him. I know you're hungry. I'm going to figure it out. I promise you. You've been promising for a week. The words hit her square in the chest. He hadn't meant them cruel. That made them worse. I know, she said. I know I have. She didn't know she was being watched. Across the road, leaning against the post outside the feed store with his hat pulled low and a half-finished cup of coffee going cold in his hand. Elias Hartwell had seen the whole thing. He'd arrived in Redemption 3 days ago. Passing through same as always. He had a talent for horseshoes and a tolerance for moving. He'd been moving for 4 years, ever since the house in Wichita became too quiet to sleep in. He went where the work was and left when it ran out, and he'd gotten very good at not caring about anything he didn't have to. He was watching Maggie Calloway crouch in the cold in front of her boy and make a promise she wasn't sure she could keep, and something in his chest was doing something he didn't appreciate. He'd seen the scene in the Mercantile through the window, hadn't gone in. Told himself it wasn't his business. Told himself the same thing 3 times, which should have been his first warning that his body had already decided different. He watched her stand up, watched her take Rose's hand and Nathan's arm, and start walking back the way they'd come, because there was nowhere else to go. He watched the set of her shoulders straight as a fence post, not because she wasn't afraid, but because she'd apparently decided that fear was something she'd deal with later privately, where her children couldn't see it. He recognized that posture. He'd worn it himself for a long time. He didn't follow her. Not yet. He finished his cold coffee and went back to the livery and spent an hour working on a set of draft horseshoes that didn't need any more work because he needed something to do with his hands while his brain caught up with the decision the rest of him had already made. That evening, he rode out along the western road until he found her claim. He'd asked around careful-like the way a man asks when he doesn't want anyone to know he's asking. Widow Calloway out on the Henderson plot. Quarter section good water access, but the cabin wasn't much. He saw that was true when he came up over the rise in the fading light.
This story
The
was
cabin
posted
was
on the
standing
channel The
technically.
Rusty Saddle.
That
Please
was
do
the
not
most
repost
charitable
it in
thing
any
that could be
form.
said about it. One wall had a gap where the chinking had come loose that would let in wind like an open door. The roof had a sag over the east end that wouldn't survive a serious snow load. The woodpile was maybe a week's worth if they burned conservatively, and with a gap like that in the wall, they wouldn't be burning conservatively. He sat on his horse on the ridge and watched. Maggie was at the woodpile working an axe that was a size too big for her, splitting with determination, if not exactly with technique. Nathan was hauling water from the creek, 2 buckets struggling with the weight, his thin arms shaking with it, but his jaw set in a way that said he wasn't going to put them down. Wesley had Rose by the hand and was telling her something that made her smile. Not laugh, just the small curve of her mouth that on a 5-year-old in those conditions felt like an act of courage. Eli watched all 4 of them doing the math of survival, each with their small portion of it, holding the whole thing together with the pure stubborn fact of still trying. He thought about Clara. He always thought about Clara when he didn't mean to. She'd had a smile that started in her eyes before it reached her mouth. She'd had a way of humming while she cooked that filled a room so completely he hadn't understood what silence meant until it was gone. He'd been 12 miles away when she needed him. He'd been delivering a horse to a man in Ellsworth when his wife and unborn daughter ran out of time. He'd carried that 12 miles every day for 4 years. He turned his horse around and rode back to town. The mercantile was closed, but Eli had steady hands and a toolkit, and he knew how a pin tumbler lock worked from the other side. He left more money on the counter than the supplies were worth. He was precise about that. He counted it twice because stealing wasn't something he was willing to do, even for a good reason. He wrote nothing, just left the coins lined up neat beside the register where Deaver would see them in the morning and know exactly what they were for. He loaded flour, salt-dried beans, fatback coffee, a tin of molasses nails, and 2 lengths of canvas into his saddlebags and a burlap sack he tied to the horn. He rode back out to the claim in the full dark, moving quiet, and left everything on the doorstep arranged in a way that wouldn't tip over in the wind. He was back in Redemption before midnight. He slept better than he had in 4 years. He didn't examine that too closely. When Maggie stepped outside at dawn to get kindling for the morning fire, she stopped so suddenly she nearly went off the step. She stared at the supplies for a long time. Long enough that Nathan came out behind her, sleep-creased and suspicious, and stood at her shoulder, looking at the same thing. "Where'd that come from?" he said. "I don't know." "Did you ask someone?" "No." Nathan looked at the flour sack, the beans, the coffee. His jaw did the thing it did when he was working something out. "Maybe it was Mrs. Cooper. She seems decent. Agnes would have said something." "Then who?" "I don't know, Nathan." She crouched and checked the supplies like she expected them to be wrong somehow, like there'd be a catch in them. There wasn't. Just food. Just what they needed. "But we'll find out and we'll pay it back." "How?" "I don't know that either." She stood up. "Go get your brother and sister. Tell them breakfast is happening." She heard him go inside. She heard his voice, the shift from adult mode back to brother mode, that easy slide that 12-year-old boys could still do when they forgot to be grown up. Heard Wes's whoop and Rose's small sound of surprise. Maggie stood on the step alone for a moment, her hand over her mouth, and let herself feel the relief before she had to go back to not feeling it. "Thank you," she said to nobody, to the cold morning air, to whatever Grace had decided they were still worth something. Then she went inside to make breakfast. In town, Agnes Cooper was pouring coffee for her one overnight boarder when the door to her establishment opened and Elias Hartwell walked in, same as he had every morning for 3 days now. Same spot at the end of the counter. Same order black coffee, whatever was hot. Agnes was 58 years old, and she'd been watching people for 58 years, and she was very good at it. She set his coffee down without him asking. "You're up early," she said. "Always am?" "Or you never slept?" She leaned on the counter. I heard there was a woman in Devers yesterday. Eli looked at his coffee. 3 children. Asked for credit. Gerald was Gerald about it. Agnes paused. Edna Marsh has already told the story twice and she's adding to it each time. What's she adding? Scandal, mostly. The kind women like Edna need to feel better about the fact that they didn't do a thing. Agnes watched his face. You know who she is. I know her name. Then you know her situation. I know enough. Agnes was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that meant she was deciding something. Maggie Calloway came to this town with a husband who turned out to be a beautiful liar. She worked her fingers raw trying to hold things together. When Thomas died, the town didn't see a widow. They saw proof that she'd failed at the one thing a woman's supposed to be good at. She paused. She hasn't asked a soul for help. Not once. Too proud, some people say. I call it something else. Eli looked up at her then. What do you call it? Dignity, Agnes said. The expensive kind. The kind you pay for with loneliness. He drank his coffee. She's got 3 children, Agnes said, and a cabin that won't make it through January. I know. Agnes straightened up, picked up her rag, and wiped the already clean counter. Well, she said in the tone of a woman who'd said everything she needed to say, and was now leaving the rest of it to someone else's conscience. Nice morning for a ride. The trouble came calling on a Thursday. Maggie was in the yard patching the loose chinking on the east wall she'd found clay by the creek, mixed it with straw, the way Nathan had read about in an old farming almanac they'd traded a chicken egg for when the rider came up the road. Harlan Doss rode a black horse. He always rode a black horse. He was a heavy-set man, with a groomed mustache, and the kind of clothes that cost more than a working man made in a month. And he wore them with the ease of a man who'd never had to think about money, because money had never thought about leaving him. Mrs. Calloway. He tipped his hat. The courtesy in it felt like a threat wearing a hat. Fine morning. Mr. Doss. She set down her clay and wiped her hands on her apron, kept the wall behind her. I don't recall inviting visitors. Now I was just passing through. He looked around the property with the particular gaze of a man assessing inventory. I see you've been making improvements. Trying to? He dismounted, which she hadn't invited him to do either. It's a fine piece of land. Good water access. Spring-fed, isn't it, the creek on the north edge? Mr. Doss? I've been reviewing the land office records. He said it conversationally, like he was discussing weather. Your husband filed a provisional claim on this plot, but I don't see the final registration completed. Technically speaking, this land may not be as secure as you believe. Maggie's chest went cold. Thomas filed that claim 2 years ago. The provisional, yes, but the final deed requires a filing fee, a witnessed signature, and a completed survey, none of which appear in the record. He smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. It never reached his eyes with Harlan Doss. Now, I want you to know, I have no desire to cause hardship. I've come to offer a solution. If you were to vacate the property by the 1st of December, I'd be prepared to pay you $200. That's more than generous given the circumstances. I'm not vacating. Mrs. Calloway. This is my children's home. Her voice was flat and final. Thomas may have been careless about many things. I am not careless about this. Whatever paperwork needs completing, I will complete it. Doss studied her for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes, not quite respect, but the recognition of an obstacle that was going to require more force than he'd initially planned for. The 1st of December, he said again softly. Think on it. He tipped his hat again and rode away. Maggie stood in her yard and watched him go until the road was empty. Then she pressed both fists against the cold wall of her cabin and stood there breathing. Nathan appeared at her elbow. She hadn't heard him come out. How long were you listening? She said. Long enough. A pause. Mama, are we going to lose the land? She turned and looked at her son. At the worry he was too young to be carrying at the jaw he kept setting, because he'd seen her set hers and thought that was how you survived.
This story was
She
posted
thought
on the
about
channel
lying
The
to him.
Rusty Saddle.
She'd
Please
done
do
it
not
before,
repost
small,
it in any
merciful
form.
lies, the kind that buy a child one more day of not being afraid. But Nathan had stopped being fooled by small, merciful lies sometime around his 11th birthday, and she respected him too much to keep trying. "Not if I can help it," she said, "and I am going to help it, every legal way I know how." "And if there's not a legal way," Maggie looked back at the empty road. "Then we'll find a better way," she said. It was the afternoon of that same Thursday that she saw him for the first time up close. She'd taken Rose into town to post a letter to a land solicitor in Topeka, a man whose name Agnes Cooper had pressed into her hand that morning with the quiet urgency of someone passing a lifeline. Maggie walked with Rose's hand in hers, and she was looking at the letter in her other hand, checking the address one more time when she nearly walked straight into the man coming out of the blacksmith's. She stopped. He stopped. He was taller than she'd registered from a distance. Dark-haired, wind-burned, with hands that had been working with iron long enough to leave their mark on them. He had a quiet face, not a closed face, but a contained one, the kind that had learned to hold things carefully. He removed his hat. "Ma'am, beg your pardon." "No, my fault. I wasn't watching." She folded the letter. "Mr. Hartwell, Eli Hartwell." She studied him for 1 second longer than was strictly polite. "You're the blacksmith, the one Agnes took on." "Temporary," he said. The word came out like a habit. Rose, who had been pressed against Maggie's leg, peered up at him with the particular frank examination that 5-year-olds reserved for things they hadn't decided about yet. Eli looked down at her. Something shifted briefly in his expression there, and gone like a shadow crossing a field. "This your daughter? One of my 3. He nodded, once settled his hat back on, and stepped aside to give her the walk. "Have a good afternoon, Mrs. Calloway." She paused. "How do you know my name?" "Small town," he said simply. She watched him walk away, that particular walk of a man who'd learned to take up only the space he needed, and not a step more. Rose tugged her hand. "Mama, his eyes are sad." "Hush, Rose. They are, though." Maggie looked down at her daughter, this small girl who'd stopped talking for 3 weeks and had now chosen this moment, this observation, as the thing worth saying. "Yes," she said quietly. "I reckon they are." She mailed her letter. On the walk home, she thought about sad eyes and hands built for hard work, and a man who'd said the word temporary, the way people say things they're not entirely sure they still believe. She thought about Harlan Doss and December 1st and a deed that might not be registered right. She thought about her 3 children, her clay-patched wall, her 43 cents. And she thought the way a woman thinks when she's too tired and too proud and too desperate for anything else. She thought, "Lord, if you've got something planned, now would be a good time to start." That night, the temperature dropped 12 degrees. In the livery, Eli lay on his back in the hayloft and stared at the ceiling and listened to the wind and did not sleep. He thought about a spring-fed creek and a cabin with a bad wall. He thought about a 12-year-old boy who stepped forward when he should have stepped back, which was also the exact thing the right kind of man did. He thought about Rose's face looking up at him and saying nothing, just looking. He thought about Clara. He thought about the way she used to say, "Well, Eli," when he was being stubborn with that particular weight on the well. That meant she'd already figured out what he was going to do before he had. "Well, Eli." He put his arm over his eyes. The wind pushed at the walls of the livery and found the gaps and came through cold and searching the way trouble always did. He'd told himself he was passing through. He was starting to wonder who he'd been trying to convince. He was up before dawn. Eli didn't decide it so much as find himself already doing it, boots on coat, on saddlebag in hand, moving through the dark livery with the quiet efficiency of a man whose body had made up its mind while his brain was still arguing. He loaded the extra canvas he'd bought off the supply wagon 2 days ago. A coil of good rope, a box of square nails, his hammer and his draw knife, and the small handsaw he kept sharpened out of habit. He told himself he was just looking at the wall. That was all. Just going to look at the chinking problem, assess the situation, and if he happened to have tools with him, well, that wasn't a commitment. That was just being practical. The ride out to the claim took 20 minutes in the dark. The cold was the serious kind, now the kind that got into your lungs and reminded you it meant business. When he came up over the rise, he could see one window, lit the dim, careful light of a fire, being managed by someone who knew how to make wood last. She was already awake. He found that out when he dismounted at the yard fence, and she opened the cabin door with a cast-iron pan held at shoulder height, which was a reasonable response to a stranger arriving at your property before sunrise, and he respected it completely. "Mrs. Calloway." He kept his hands visible. "It's Hartwell, from the blacksmith." A long pause. She lowered the pan, but only slightly. "Mr. Hartwell, it's not yet 5 in the morning. "Yes, ma'am. I apologize for the hour." He gestured towards the east wall. "I was thinking about your chinking problem." Another pause, longer this time. "You were thinking about my chinking problem. The clay mix will help, but with the temperature dropping the way it is, it won't cure right before it freezes. You'll lose it before January and be back where you started." He kept his voice practical, matter of fact, the way you talked about a wall when you didn't want to talk about anything else. "I've got canvas and nails. I can put a weather break over the outside of that wall in about an hour. Buys you time till spring when you can repack it proper." Maggie Calloway stood in her doorway in the cold and looked at him the way a woman looked at something she wanted very badly but had learned not to reach for. Suspicious and hoping at the same time, which was its own kind of grief when you thought about it. "Why?" she said. "Because it needs doing." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I've got right now." He met her eyes. "I'm not asking for anything, Mrs. Calloway. I'm asking you to let me fix your wall." The pan came down to her side. She stepped back from the door. "Coffee's on," she said, which was not yes and was not no, but was the closest thing to trust she had available at 5 in the morning, and Eli understood it perfectly. He had the canvas up before the children woke. He could hear them through the wall, the sounds of a house coming alive. Small voices, the creak of a rope bed. Wesley's laugh at something Nathan said, low and grudging. He worked steady and quiet, and when Nathan appeared in the yard an hour later, still buttoning his coat, the boy stopped and looked at the new canvas panel, and then looked at Eli and didn't say anything for a full 10 seconds. "Did my mother hire you?" Nathan said. "No." "Then what are you doing here?" Eli drove another nail. "Fixing your wall." "We don't need charity." "It's not charity, it's carpentry." He glanced at the boy. "You want to hand me that next nail, or are we going to keep discussing definitions?" Nathan's jaw did the setting thing. He picked up the nail and held it out with all the warmth of a judge passing sentence, and Eli took it without comment and drove it home. They worked in silence for a while. Eli noticed the boy watching his technique, not admiring, just recording the way smart kids cataloged information before they decided what to do with it. "You know what you're doing," Nathan said finally. "Some." "Where'd you learn?" "My father. And 4 years of fixing things that needed fixing." He moved to the next section. "Hand me 2 more." Nathan handed them over. "Are you going to leave?" The question came out flat, like he'd been practicing the flatness of it. Like he'd learned that if you ask the question without feeling in your voice, the answer hurt less. Eli stopped what he was doing. He turned and looked at the boy. Really looked the way this kid deserved to be looked at, straight and honest. "I don't know," he said. "I'm not going to lie to you about that." Nathan's chin came up. "At least you're honest about it." "I try to be." "My father was honest too." A pause. "At first." Eli didn't fill that silence with reassurance because Nathan wasn't a boy who needed reassurance. He was a boy who needed the truth, and the truth was complicated, and the most respectful thing Eli could do was let the complicated truth sit there without dressing it up. "That's a hard thing to carry," Eli said.
This
"Yeah."
story was posted on the channel The
Nathan
Rusty
looked at the
Saddle.
canvas
Please do
panel,
not
solid
repost
and
it in
flush
any
against the
form.
wall. It is. Inside, Maggie was making cornmeal mush with the last of the meal and trying not to think about the fact that it was the last of it when the door opened and Wes came in from the yard, looking like he'd discovered something magnificent. "Mama, that man is fixing our wall." "I know, Wes. He's really good at it. Nathan's helping him." Maggie kept stirring. "Is he now?" "Nathan's not even being rude." Wesley said it with the tone of a scientist reporting an unusual phenomenon. "Well, he's being a little rude, but not his regular amount. That's progress. Can he stay for breakfast?" She thought about the pot of mush and how far it needed to stretch. She thought about a man who'd shown up at 5 in the morning with canvas and nails, and no explanation except that it needed doing. She thought about Nathan handing him a nail, which was the closest her oldest son had come to trusting a grown man in 18 months. "Yes," she said, "he can stay." Eli sat at the end of the table and ate what he was given without commenting on the simplicity of it, which was the exact right thing to do. Rose sat across from him and watched him with her solemn 5-year-old eyes, and at one point pushed her carved wooden horse across the table toward him without a word. He looked at it. He looked at her. He picked it up carefully, examined it with the seriousness it deserved, and set it back down in front of her. "That's fine work," he said quietly. "Who carved it?" Rose looked at her mother. "It was a gift," Maggie said. "We don't know who." Eli looked at his coffee. "Somebody with good taste," he said. He didn't stay long after breakfast. He had work at the smithy, and he didn't want to wear out whatever fragile welcome he'd been given. He was at the door, hat in hand, when Maggie stopped him. "Mr. Hartwell." He turned. She was standing at the kitchen table, both hands on the back of a chair, and she had the look of a woman deciding whether to show one of her cards. "I received a visit from Harlan Doss yesterday." He waited. "He claims my claim isn't properly registered, that Thomas didn't complete the final filing." She held his gaze. "I don't know enough about land law to know if he's right. Agnes gave me the name of a solicitor in Topeka, but that takes time, and Doss gave me until December 1st. December 1st is 5 weeks. I'm aware." Eli turned his hat in his hands once. "I've had some dealings with land office work. Not legal training, but I know the process." He paused. "If you have Thomas's original paperwork, I can look at it. Tell you what you've got." "Why would you do that?" The question again. She kept asking it, and he kept not having a clean answer, and he appreciated that she didn't let him off the hook by not asking. "Because Harlan Doss is the kind of man I've met before," he said. "And I've walked away from that kind of man doing that kind of thing once in my life already. I don't plan to do it again." Something shifted in her expression. Not softness exactly, more like recognition. The look of someone who understood what it meant to carry a decision you'd made wrong and not be willing to make it the same way twice. "I'll get the papers," she said. The documents were a mess, which was very much in keeping with everything Eli had come to understand about Thomas Calloway, a man of good intentions and catastrophic follow-through. The provisional claim was there, dated and witnessed. The survey receipt was there. What was missing was the final transfer fee payment confirmation, which should have been a stamped slip from the land office. "Did Thomas ever mention going back to the land office after the first filing?" Eli asked. Maggie sat across the table, Rose in her lap, Nathan and Wesley doing schoolwork on the floor nearby, or pretending to because they were both very obviously listening. "He said he'd handled it," she said. "He said that about a lot of things." "Meaning he might have paid it and lost the receipt, or he might not have paid it at all." "Both are equally possible." She said it without bitterness, which was a kind of discipline Eli found extraordinary. "What does that mean for the claim?" It means DOS might be technically right about the registration, but it also means the solution is simple. Pay the filing fee, get a new stamp, and the claim is complete. The question is whether the land office clerk will process it straight or whether DOS has gotten there first. Nathan looked up from his school book. DOS bribed the clerk, he said matter of fact. Nathan, Maggie said, that's what people do, isn't it? When they want something, and the law won't just give it to them. Eli looked at the 12-year-old. That's sometimes what people do, he said carefully. It's also something that can be undone if you've got witnesses and documentation and someone willing to make noise about it in the right places. Nathan held his gaze. Are you willing to make noise about it? I'm thinking on it. That's not a real answer either. Eli almost smiled. He kept it contained. No, he said. I reckon it isn't. He took the documents with him when he left with Maggie's permission, and he spent that evening at Agnes Cooper's table with the papers spread out, and Agnes providing what she called her considerable experience, observing men who lied about land, which turned out to be extensive. DOS has been working this county for 6 years, Agnes said, refilling his coffee without asking. He's gotten 4 families off their claims. Always the same way. Find the paperwork gap, get to the clerk, offer the widow just enough money that leaving looks like the reasonable choice. What happened to the families that left? Agnes set the coffee pot down. 2 of them ended up in town working for wages. 1 went back east. The 4th, she paused. Dorothea Webb, 3 children, same as Maggie. She took the money, bought passage to her sisters in Missouri. She folded her hands. She wrote me once from there. Said she still dreamed about the creek on her land. Said she could hear it in her sleep. Eli looked at the papers. Which clerk does DOS use? Pete Garfield. Young man, ambitious, underpaid, and weak-willed in that particular order. Agnes tilted her head. But Pete Garfield is also terrified of Harold Winslow. Who's Harold Winslow? The Territorial Land Commissioner. Comes through twice a year. Agnes's expression sharpened with the particular satisfaction of a woman who'd been storing a useful piece of information and had been waiting for exactly the right moment to spend it. He was here in September. He's due back in November, last week of November if I remember the schedule correctly. Eli looked up at her. Which would be, Agnes continued pleasantly, just before December 1st. He rode out to the claim the next morning with cleaner news and a cleaner plan, and he was halfway through explaining the land commissioner's schedule when Maggie put her hand up. Wait, she said. Say that again. Winslow comes through the last week of November. If we can document the provisional claim, get testimony from the original survey witnesses, and file the correction directly with the commissioner rather than Garfield Doss's arrangement with the clerk, becomes irrelevant. Maggie was quiet for a moment. Outside, he could hear Wes and Nathan chopping wood, Nathan correcting Wes's form in a tone that was almost not quite but almost exactly the tone Eli had used on him yesterday morning. Do you know how to do that? She said. File with the commissioner. I know the process. Have you done it before? He paused. Something like it. I had a different job before I was a blacksmith. She waited. She was good at waiting, he'd noticed. She didn't fill silences the way anxious people did, didn't rush to cover up the empty space. She just let it sit there until the other person decided what to put in it. I was a federal marshal, he said. Territorial. For 6 years before. He stopped. Before I stopped. Before your wife died. He looked at her. She held his gaze steady. Not prying. Not apologetic, just present with the fact of it, the way Agnes had been present with his grief the first morning he'd come in for coffee, just acknowledging it existed without trying to fix it or minimize it. Yes, he said. Before that. So you know how the territorial system works. Better than most. And you're willing to use that knowledge for us. He thought about what he'd said to her the day before. about walking away from the kind of man who used the system against people who didn't know how to fight back, about having done it once already and not being willing to do it again. He thought about Clara not with the usual twist of guilt, but with something quieter, the sense that she would have walked
This
straight
story
up
was
to this
posted on the
problem
channel
and
The
handled
Rusty
it,
Saddle.
and that
Please do
standing
not
here
repost it
figuring
in
out
any
how to
form.
handle it on behalf of a woman with 3 hungry children was probably the most like himself he'd been in 4 years. "Yes," he said. "I am." Something moved across Maggie's face, then relief and wariness tangled together, not quite trusting itself. "I don't understand you, Mr. Hartwell," she said. "I want to be honest about that. I don't know what you want from this." "Nothing. Everyone wants something. I want—" He stopped. Started again. "I want to sleep at night. I want to do the right thing, because it's the right thing, not because there's a ledger somewhere being kept." He paused. "And I want Harlan Doss to learn that some people don't move when he tells them to." That last part surprised a short, involuntary sound out of her. Not quite a laugh, but the shape of one, and it changed her whole face for half a second. He filed that away without meaning to. "All right," she said. "Then we have a plan. We have the beginning of one. That's more than I had yesterday." She looked at the documents he'd set on the table between them. "What do we need first?" "The original survey witnesses. Do you know who they were?" "One of them was Agnes Cooper." He looked up. Of course it was. "And the other was a man named Caleb Pruitt. He runs cattle about 8 miles east of here." "I know Pruitt. I shot his horses last week. He's a straight man." "Will he testify?" "I think so, if I ask him right." Maggie nodded. She picked up one of the documents and looked at it. Her husband's handwriting slanted and hurried, the handwriting of a man who was always moving toward the next thing, never quite finishing the thing in front of him. Her expression was unreadable, but her fingers went flat against the paper for a moment, pressing it smooth. "He wasn't a bad man," she said, quietly. Not to Eli specifically, just to the air in front of her. "He was just not a careful one. And in this life that amounts to the same damage." Eli didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say to that. Nothing that would make it lighter or smaller or easier to carry. It was just true. Some truths didn't need commentary. They just needed to be witnessed by someone who wasn't going to look away from them. After a moment, she set the paper down, squared the edges of the stack with efficient hands, looked up at him with eyes that had gone from grief back to business, that particular transition she made so cleanly, he almost missed the seam of it. "When can you talk to Pruitt?" she said. "Tomorrow morning." "And Agnes?" "This evening, if she'll sit still long enough." He picked up his hat. "She already knows something's coming. She's been knowing it since before I walked through her door. Agnes has a gift for that. She has a gift for a lot of things." He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the frame. "Mrs. Calloway, in the meantime, keep your doors bolted at night. And if Doss sends anyone to the property, you don't engage. You send Nathan for me." Her chin came up. "I can handle—" "I know you can. I'm asking you not to have to." He held her gaze. "Just till we get this sorted. After that, you handle whatever you want, however you want, and I'll stay out of it." A beat of silence. The wind moved outside, pressing at the new canvas panel, and it held. "Fine," she said. He nodded, stepped off the porch, and went to his horse. He could feel her watching from the doorway as he mounted, the same way he'd felt her watching from the ridge that first night, though the watching had a different quality to it now. Less assessment. Something else he didn't have a word for yet, and wasn't sure he was ready to find one. He rode back toward town. The sky had gone pale gray in the west, the particular color that meant a weather system building, and the wind was picking up from the north with a focused, purposeful cold that felt personal. He had witnesses to find and documents to file, and a land commissioner due in 3 weeks, and a corrupt clerk standing between Maggie Calloway and the home her children needed to survive the winter. He had a plan that could work if the pieces fell right, and the man from Topeka was as straight as his reputation, and if Harlan Doss didn't figure out what was happening before they were ready. He had, for the first time in 4 years, somewhere specific to be and something specific to do when he got there. He didn't let himself think about what came after. After was a door he hadn't opened in a long time, and he wasn't ready for what might be standing on the other side of it. But the door was there, and he knew it now, and knowing it was already different from the long years when he'd been so certain there was nothing left in any direction but more of the same. That he thought, as the first thin flakes of early snow began to fall, was going to have to be enough for now. Caleb Pruitt was a man of few words and strong opinions, which Eli had figured out during the 2 hours he'd spent shoeing the man's horses the previous week. Pruitt watched people the way he watched weather-steady patient, waiting to see what they were actually made of before he committed to an opinion. He'd given Eli exactly 3 sentences of conversation during the entire shoeing job, which Eli had taken as a sign of respect rather than rudeness, because some men showed trust by not wasting it on small talk. He found Pruitt at his fence line mending a post, and the older man looked up once and went back to his work without stopping. Hartwell. Pruitt. I need to talk to you about Maggie Calloway's land claim. Pruitt drove a nail. Figured somebody would eventually. You witnessed the original survey. I did. 2 years ago this past August. Thomas Calloway was there. Margaret was there. The surveyor was a man named Fletcher out of Dodge City, and I signed my name to the paper because I watched Fletcher walk every corner of that quarter section and mark it legal. He drove another nail. What's the problem? The final registration fee payment is missing from the land office record. Pruitt was quiet for a moment. He straightened up and looked at Eli directly for the first time. Pete Garfield's record. Yes. And Harlan Doss has been to see the widow. Gave her until December 1st. Pruitt set his hammer down on the fence post. He had the face of a man running calculations. Not emotional ones, practical ones, the kind that came from decades of watching how the machinery of this particular county worked and exactly who had their hands on which lever. Land commissioners due in November, he said. Last week of the month. And you want my testimony filed with Winslow directly, not Garfield. That's what I'm asking. Pruitt picked up his hammer again. He turned it in his hand once the way men handled a tool when they were using the weight of it to think. Thomas Calloway owed me $40, he said. Never paid it back. Died still owing it. He paused. His wife doesn't owe me $40. His wife never borrowed a cent from anyone. He looked at Eli. She just got stuck with his debt and his reputation, and 3 children and a piece of land that should be hers by every right that matters. Yes. I'll testify. He said it simply the way he said everything. Write up whatever you need me to sign, and I'll sign it. And you tell Margaret Calloway that Caleb Pruitt said she doesn't owe this county a single apology for anything. Eli held the man's gaze. I'll tell her. Good. Pruitt went back to his fencing. Now let me work. I've got 6 more posts before dark. Agnes had already drafted her own statement by the time Eli got back to town, which did not surprise him at all. She slid it across the counter with the efficiency of a woman who'd been waiting to be asked and had prepared accordingly. I wrote it out last week, she said, when I heard Doss had been seen riding the western road. Eli read it. It was precise, dated, detailed, and written in the kind of clear, firm hand that didn't leave room for misinterpretation. This is good, he said. I know it is. She refilled his coffee. I also wrote a letter to Harold Winslow. Personal correspondence, not official. I've known Harold for 11 years. We served on the same Territorial Relief Committee after the drought of '69. She folded her hands on the counter. I told him to expect a land dispute matter requiring his direct attention when he arrives. I told him it involved a pattern of behavior by a specific party that he would want to know about. Eli looked up from the statement. Agnes. Don't Agnes me. I've been watching Harlan Doss maneuver this town for 6 years, and I've been waiting for someone with the right knowledge and the right stubbornness to stand still long enough for me to hand them the tools. She fixed him with a look that was half affection and half iron. You're the first one. He was quiet for a moment. You're playing a longer game than I am. I've been playing it since before you rode into town. She tilted her head. How is she? Holding. And the children. Nathan's coming around. Wes is Wes. He paused. Rose still doesn't talk much. Agnes's expression softened in the particular way it did when she was feeling something she'd decided not to say out loud. Rose talked constantly before Thomas died. Used to come in here with Maggie on supply days and tell me everything she knew about butterflies. Everything. More butterfly information than any 5-year-old should reasonably possess. She was quiet a moment.
This story was
Grief takes
posted on the
different shapes
channel
in
The
children.
Rusty Saddle.
For
Please do
Rose,
not
it took her
repost it
words.
in any form.
They'll come back. I know, Eli said. And then before he could stop himself, she pushed her wooden horse across the table to me yesterday. Didn't say anything, just offered it. Agnes looked at him steadily. That's Rose Calloway saying she trusts you. A pause. That child doesn't give her trust to anyone who hasn't earned it. He didn't say anything to that. He folded Agnes's statement and put it with Pruitt's, and picked up his coffee and looked out the window at the street. Redemption was going about its businessmen, moving between the feed store and the hardware. A wagon unloading at the far end of the road, Edna Marsh coming out of the dress shop with her head already tilting toward the woman beside her in the way that meant a story was being passed along. People are talking, he said. People are always talking. The question is what they're saying. Edna Marsh is saying Maggie and I have an improper arrangement. Agnes made a sound that landed somewhere between a snort and a laugh. Edna Marsh said the same thing about me and the Reverend Colton because I lent him an umbrella in the rain. What Edna Marsh says and what matters are two different counties. She paused. What does worry me is that Doss is smart enough to use it. Not because it's true, but because he knows this town will believe it before they believe a widow. Eli set down his cup. He already mentioned it. Told me the town council had concerns about moral conduct. He'll use that as leverage if the land play starts to fail. Agnes leaned forward. Which means we need Winslow here before Doss figures out you've gone around Garfield. Once Winslow has the documentation and the testimony in hand, Doss has no move left. 3 weeks. 3 weeks, she agreed. Keep your head down. Keep the children safe. And Eli. She waited until he looked at her. Don't give Doss anything to use. Be careful. He knew what she meant. He nodded once and left the money for his coffee on the counter and went back out into the cold. He was careful. For 12 days, he was careful. He came to the claim every morning and worked on the wood supply on the fence that needed resetting on the section of the cabin floor that had a soft spot from where water had gotten under it. He worked alongside Nathan, who had gone from openly hostile to quietly observant to, by the end of the first week, occasionally asking questions that weren't rhetorical. He showed Wesley how to split kindling with a smaller hatchet in a way that was efficient and safe, and Wesley, being Wesley, immediately invented 3 variations on the technique and wanted to demonstrate all of them. He ate breakfast with them when Maggie offered it and left before supper because Agnes had said be careful and he was trying. He didn't stay for supper until the 9th day when the temperature dropped so fast and so hard in the late afternoon that riding back to town would have meant crossing the creek in near dark with ice forming on the banks, and Maggie told him flatly that she wasn't going to be responsible for a man drowning in her creek on account of stubbornness. It's 2 feet deep, he said. It's 2 feet deep and 30 degrees, and your horse has been working all day. She held the door open. Supper's beans and cornbread. Sit down. He sat down. It was the best meal he'd eaten in 4 years, and it was beans and cornbread which told him something he wasn't entirely ready to know. Wesley talked through the entire meal about a hawk he'd seen by the north fence, about a mathematical problem from his reader, that he was convinced had a wrong answer about whether horses dreamed about what Eli thought happened to rivers in winter. Did they slow down, or did they just look slow from the outside? Eli answered each question seriously and completely, which was the only way to answer Wesley's questions, because the boy had an unerring instinct for when adults were giving him partial answers to make him go away. Nathan ate and listened, and said nothing, but he refilled Eli's coffee without being asked, which was the kind of thing that didn't mean nothing. Rose sat across from Eli with her wooden horse beside her plate and ate her cornbread in small methodical bites. Halfway through the meal, she looked up at him and said, "Do you know any stories?" The table went quiet. Maggie's spoon paused. Nathan looked up. Wesley stopped mid-sentence about river physics. Eli looked at Rose. "What kind of stories?" She considered this seriously. "The kind where somebody gets found," she said. He held very still for a moment. "The kind where somebody gets found." 5 years old, and she'd put her finger on the exact nerve of it with the precision of someone who didn't know she was doing surgery. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I know a few of those." "Will you tell one?" "Rose," Maggie started. "It's all right." Eli looked at Maggie once, then back at Rose. "After the dishes, if your mother says it's okay." Maggie looked at her daughter, at this small girl who'd pushed a wooden horse across a table at a stranger and asked for a story about being found, and something moved across her face that she didn't try to hide. "After the dishes," she said. He told them about a dog he'd found in a snowstorm outside of Ellsworth in the winter of '71. Lost, half frozen, so far gone, it didn't even have the energy to be scared anymore. He'd brought it into the stable and fed it jerky and talked to it all night because sometimes the only thing that kept a living thing going was the sound of another living thing nearby. By morning, it was standing up. By the second day, it was eating properly. By the end of the week, it had found a family 2 farms over who'd been looking for it since October. "Was it happy?" Rose said. "When it got found. It wagged so hard, it nearly knocked the farmer's daughter over." Rose nodded slowly, processing this. "Because it had been scared for a long time," she said. "Yes. And then it wasn't scared anymore." "That's right." She picked up her wooden horse and held it against her chest and didn't say anything else. But she didn't go quiet the way she usually went quiet. She went quiet the way people went quiet when they were thinking about something that had just settled something inside them. Eli looked at the fire. He was aware of Maggie watching him from across the table. Aware of it the way you were aware of warmth in a cold room, not intrusive. Just present, something your body registered before your mind got around to it. He left after the children were in bed when the cold had eased enough to make the ride safe. Maggie walked out to the fence with him, which she didn't have to do and which he didn't comment on. "She hasn't asked anyone for a story since Thomas died," Maggie said. He checked his saddle cinch, gave his hands something to do. "She's going to be all right," he said. "I know she is." She pulled her coat closed at the neck. "I just needed to hear someone else say it." A pause. "You're good with them, all 3 of them, but especially you're patient with Nathan in a way that I can't always be. Because I know him too well. I know every wall he's built, and I helped him build some of them without meaning to. He's building something different now," Eli said. "He's deciding whether to trust. That's not a wall. That's a door." She was quiet a moment. The dark was full around them, the stars very clear and cold overhead. "What happened to the dog?" she said. "After it went home." He looked at her. "I don't know. I moved on. I always moved on." She held his gaze. "Is that what you're going to do?" The question sat there between them, plain and direct, which was exactly Maggie Calloway's way. She didn't dress things up. She didn't make it easier for him by pretending she hadn't asked. "I don't know," he said. He wanted to give her more than that. He didn't have more than that yet. "That's not a dodge. I genuinely don't know. I haven't let myself think past the next step in a long time." "Because of Clara." Her name and Maggie's voice in the dark didn't hurt the way it usually did. It just sat there like a real thing that had existed, which was what Clara was, a real person who had existed, not a wound, not a punishment, just someone he had loved. "Because of Clara," he said. "And because I got very good at not hoping for things." Maggie nodded slowly. "I know what that feels like." She looked up at the sky once, then back at him. "I'm not asking you to hope for anything, Mr. Hartwell. I need to know. When
This
this is
story was
settled,
posted on the
when
channel
DOS
The
is
Rusty
dealt with, when the
Saddle.
land is
Please do not
registered,
repost
and my
it in any
children are
form.
safe." She paused. "Are you going to need a reason to stay? Or are you going to need a reason to leave?" He didn't answer right away. Not because he didn't have an answer forming somewhere in the lower part of his chest, but because he wanted to be honest with her, the way he'd been honest with Nathan, not the comfortable version, the real one. "I'll tell you when I know," he said. She nodded once, as though that was exactly what she'd expected, and she'd decided it was enough for now. "Good night, Mr. Hartwell." "Good night." He rode back to town and didn't sleep again, which was different from the not sleeping he'd done for 4 years. That not sleeping had been empty. This one was full. It was the 14th day when Doss made his next move, and Eli was not at the claim when it happened. He was at Pruitt's going over the final wording of the testimony document when Nathan rode in on the old mare at a pace that said the boy had pushed her harder than was comfortable, and his face said everything before he opened his mouth. "Doss sent men," Nathan said, pulling up hard. "2 of them. They told Mama she has 2 weeks, not until December 1st. They said the schedule changed. They left something on the doorstep." He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. "Mama said to bring this to you." Eli took the paper. It was a notice, legal-looking, official stamped, claiming that the provisional claim on the Henderson plot had been formally voided for failure to complete registration, and that the land had reverted to territorial disposal, and that any structures on the property were subject to removal as of November 22nd. November 22nd, 8 days away. Pruitt read it over Eli's shoulder. "That's not legal," he said flatly. "A voiding notice requires 30 days minimum. This one's dated 4 days ago." He backdated it. "Can we prove that?" "The date on your canvas panel. You nailed it up on October 31st. I watched you from the road that morning when I was moving cattle." Pruitt looked at him steadily. "The notice says she received it October 28th. She was using that wall when you were fixing it. If the claim was voided on the 28th, why was she still maintaining the property 3 days later, as though it was hers?" He tapped the paper. "Because it was. Because this date is a lie." Nathan was watching both of them with his jaw set and his hands tight on the reins. "What do we do?" he said. Eli folded the paper. He looked at Nathan, at this 12-year-old boy who'd ridden hard through cold to bring him information, who'd trusted him with the problem instead of trying to solve it alone, which was its own kind of milestone, and Eli understood what it had cost him. "We move faster than Doss planned for," Eli said. "Nathan, ride back and tell your mother to stay inside and let no one on the property without her calling out my name first. Can you do that?" "Yes." "And Nathan." He held the boy's gaze. "You did exactly right coming here. Exactly right." Something in the boy's face eased by 1 degree, just one, but Eli counted it. Nathan turned the mare and rode hard back the way he'd come. Eli looked at Pruitt. "I need to get a rider to Winslow. Not a letter, a rider. Someone who can put the documents in his hands personally and tell him what's happening. My son-in-law runs freight to Topeka. He's leaving tomorrow morning. Can he go to Winslow directly? I'll write out exactly what to say." Pruitt was already moving toward the barn. "Write fast," he said. "He leaves at first light." Eli sat at Pruitt's kitchen table with the man's pen and the man's ink and wrote the clearest and most precise letter of his life, the facts of the claim, the timeline of Doss's interference, the falsified voiding, notice the testimony of 2 witnesses already committed, and a formal request that Commissioner Winslow expedite his November visit by 1 week, if at all possible, as a family of 4 was facing illegal removal from legally held property. He signed it with his name and his former title, which he hadn't done in 4 years. Marshal E.J. Hartwell, Territory of Kansas, retired. He stared at those words for a moment after he'd written them. They felt strange and familiar at the same time, like a coat he'd put away and forgotten still fit. He rode to the claim as the last light was leaving the sky. Maggie opened the door before he knocked, which meant she'd been watching the road. He stepped inside and found all 3 children still awake. Rose on the floor with her horse. Wesley at the table, pretending to do his reader Nathan by the window, with his arms crossed in a posture that belonged on a man twice his age. Maggie looked at him without asking. He held up the folded notice. "It's fraudulent. The date is falsified. I can prove it." He looked around at her family. "Pruitt's son-in-law is riding to Topeka tomorrow with everything Winslow needs. We just have to hold 8 days. And if Doss sends someone before then, he'll be sending them to a property with a former federal marshal on it." He said it simply. "I'll be here." Wesley's head came up. "You're a marshal." "Was." "That's the same as a sheriff, but bigger, right?" "Something like that." Wesley turned to Nathan with barely contained triumph. "I told you he wasn't just a blacksmith." Nathan didn't smile, but the set of his shoulders dropped by 1 careful degree, and he moved away from the window and sat down at the table, which in Nathan language meant he'd decided something and was done deliberating. Maggie looked at Eli across the room. Her hands were still, which for her meant she'd already processed the fear and moved through it. She'd gotten to the other side where there was only work left to do. "Stay for supper," she said. He took off his hat. "Yes, ma'am." Rose looked up from the floor. "Can you tell us what happens," she said, "after the dog gets found?" He looked at her. At this 5-year-old girl, with her wooden horse, and her careful silence, and her unerring instinct for the question underneath the question. "You know," he said, "I think I can." He pulled up a chair and sat down, and the fire crackled, and outside the November dark pressed against the windows, and Harlan Doss was somewhere in town planning his next move, and there were 8 days between this family and what they needed. But in this room at this table with these 4 people, Eli Hartwell felt the particular sensation of a man who has been standing in cold water for a long time and has just without quite meaning to stepped onto solid ground. He didn't trust it yet, but he felt it, and that after 4 years of feeling nothing was its own kind of miracle. The 8 days did not pass quietly. Doss was too smart to send men to the property directly. While Eli was there, he understood leverage, understood optics, understood that a former federal marshal on the premises changed the arithmetic of physical confrontation in ways that didn't favor him. So he worked the town instead, which was the other weapon in his arsenal and the sharper one. By the second day, the story going around Redemption was that Maggie Calloway had taken up with a drifter that the arrangement was inappropriate and possibly worse than inappropriate, and that decent Christian people had an obligation to be concerned. By the third day, 2 families had declined to buy eggs from her at the Saturday market without explanation, just a turned shoulder and a deliberate looking elsewhere. By the 4th day, Reverend Aldous had been to see Agnes Cooper with what he called pastoral concerns, and Agnes had sent him away with what she called a clear conscience and a shorter list of tolerances than he'd walked in with. Eli heard about all of it. Agnes kept him informed the way a general kept a field commander informed, precise, unemotional, tactical. He absorbed each piece of information and kept his face neutral and his hands occupied and did not let himself react in town, because reacting in town was exactly what Doss was engineering him toward. What he did not tell Agnes, because he was still figuring out what to do with it himself, was that the gossip was not entirely wrong about one thing. Not about impropriety. Not about anything that would have given Edna Marsh's imagination the satisfaction it was looking for. But about the fact that something was changing in him had been changing since the morning he'd knocked on a door before sunrise with canvas and nails and a reason he couldn't fully explain, and was now changing faster than he knew how to manage. He noticed it in small things. The way he knew without looking at the window when it was the hour Maggie came out to start the morning fire. The way his chest did something specific when Rose put her wooden horse on the table near his coffee cup, which she now did every morning as a matter of routine, as though she'd decided his spot at the table had been his for a while, and she just hadn't told him yet. The way he'd started thinking when he rode back to Agnes's at night, not about the road ahead, but about the road back. He didn't say any of this. He kept it where he'd been keeping difficult things for 4 years.
This story
down,
was posted
and
on the
quiet in
channel The
part of
Rusty
himself
Saddle.
he'd closed
Please
off
do not
after Clara
repost it
the
in
room
any
he'd
form.
locked, because opening it had felt like betrayal, and also like falling, and he'd already fallen so far once that he wasn't sure he'd survive the ground a second time. But it was there, and it was getting harder to pretend it wasn't. On the 5th day, Doss changed tactics. He came to the claim himself, which Eli had not expected because Doss was the kind of man who generally preferred to work through intermediaries. He rode up the road at mid-morning with a single companion, a man in a dark coat who had the look of someone with legal training and the expression of someone paid not to have opinions, and he dismounted at the fence with the careful courtesy of a man who had calculated exactly how much courtesy the situation required. Eli was at the woodpile. He set down his axe and stood where he was. "Hartwell," Doss said pleasantly, "I'd like to speak with Mrs. Calloway. She's busy. I'm sure she can spare a moment." He looked at the cabin. "It's to her benefit." Maggie came out before Eli could answer, which was entirely in keeping with who she was. She stood on the step with her arms crossed and her chin level, and the particular expression she wore when she'd already decided she wasn't going to give an inch and was just waiting to find out where the first attempt would land. "Mr. Doss?" "Mrs. Calloway." He removed his hat with practiced grace. "I wanted to come personally because I think there's been some unnecessary unpleasantness between us, and I'd like to resolve it simply." He paused. "I'm prepared to increase my offer to $300. That's considerably more than the property is currently worth, and I think you know it." "I know no such thing. The claim is voided. The voiding notice is falsified." Her voice was flat and certain. "The date on it is a lie, and we can prove it. So let's not waste each other's time pretending otherwise." Something moved in Doss's eyes just briefly. A recalculation, the recognition that she knew more than he'd expected her to know. He recovered smoothly. He was good at recovering smoothly. "That's a serious accusation." "I'm a serious woman." He looked at Eli then. Not at Maggie, at Eli, with the particular measuring look of a man assessing what something is going to cost him. "You've been helping her," he said. "That's admirable. But I want you to understand something, Hartwell. I've done some asking around about you, about your time with the Territorial Marshal's office." A pause. "About how it ended." The morning went very still. Eli kept his expression level. He'd known this was coming. Doss was too thorough not to have dug. He'd just hoped it would come later after Winslow arrived, after the land was secure. He hadn't gotten that particular grace. "What ended it?" Doss continued, unhurried, comfortable with the silence he was creating. "Was a woman and child who died while you were somewhere else. Is that right?" He said it gently, which was the cruelest possible way to say it. "And now here you are taking care of another woman and children. I have to wonder, does Mrs. Calloway know what happened to the last family that relied on you?" Maggie's head turned toward Eli, not with accusation, just the involuntary movement of someone processing new information in real time. Eli did not look at her. He held Doss's gaze, and he held it very steadily, and he felt the old wound tear open, the way it always tore open when someone put their hand on it, sudden, total, the kind of pain that didn't diminish with repetition. "My family dying," he said quietly, "was not a failure of protection. It was a fever and a storm and bad timing. If you want to use it against me, go ahead. It won't change what I know about your falsified document, or what Commissioner Winslow is going to hear when he arrives." Doss smiled thinly. "Winslow." He said the name with the tone of a man who'd heard it, and was not surprised, and had already made arrangements. "Winslow is a territorial official with a full schedule and a long list of priorities. I've corresponded with his office. He's aware there's a dispute here. He's also aware of certain contextual factors." He paused. "The moral questions surrounding this property and its current occupants. Questions a man in his position takes seriously." "You told Winslow about the gossip," Agnes said. Everyone turned. Agnes Cooper had come up the road on foot. Neither side had heard her approach, which Eli suspected was not entirely accidental. She stood at the fence with her hands folded and her expression carrying the particular weight of a woman who had heard enough. "Good morning, Agnes," Doss said. He sounded for the first time slightly less comfortable. "I wrote to Harold Winslow 11 days ago," Agnes said. She walked through the gate and stood beside Maggie on the step. "I told him exactly what's been happening here. Not gossip. Facts. Documented and dated. I've known Harold since '69, as you may or may not know." She looked at Doss with calm, absolute steadiness. "He wrote back 4 days ago. He's arriving November 17th. That's 3 days from now, Harlan, in case your calendar is as unreliable as your land records." The silence that followed had a texture to it. Eli watched Doss process the timeline, watched him run the numbers and find them coming up short, watched the smooth surface of the man's composure develop its first visible crack. 3 days, Doss said. 3 days, Agnes confirmed. And he's bringing a deputy clerk from the territorial office who is not Pete Garfield. She paused. "I thought you should know, so you could make whatever arrangements seem appropriate to you." Doss put his hat back on. He looked at Eli, then at Maggie, then at Agnes, and in that look was the cold arithmetic of a man calculating whether he had any remaining moves. He was smart enough to know when a position was lost. He was proud enough that the knowing of it turned his face to stone. "This isn't finished," he said. "Yes, it is," Agnes said. "You just haven't accepted it yet." He rode away. His companion followed without having said a single word the entire time. Nathan appeared from behind the cabin where he'd been standing silent for most of the conversation. Eli hadn't known he was there until he moved. The boy looked at the road where Doss had gone and then looked at Eli with the expression of someone who had just watched something important happen and was deciding what to make of it. "He tried to use your wife against you," Nathan said. "Yes. And you didn't." The boy stopped, worked at the words. "You didn't fall apart." "No." Nathan looked at the road again. "My father used to fall apart," he said. "Not cruel, not bitter, just factual in the way 12-year-olds were factual when they were trying to understand something about the men in their lives. When things got hard, he'd go quiet for days and then he'd disappear. First, just to town, then further." He paused. "I kept thinking it was something I did." "It wasn't something you did," Eli said. "I know that now." Nathan turned and looked at him directly. "Agnes says Winslow comes in 3 days. That's what she says. And then it's settled. The land is ours. Should be. And then—" The boy stopped again. He had his mother's quality of letting a silence sit, not filling it with something easier than what he actually wanted to say. "What do you do then?" Eli looked at this 12-year-old boy standing in his family's yard, asking the question his mother had asked at the fence 3 nights ago, and his sister had asked with a wooden horse, and his brother had asked with refilled coffee cups and unguarded grins. All of them asking the same thing in their different languages, all of them waiting for the same answer. He didn't have it yet. He was almost there. He could feel the shape of it forming the way you felt a word forming when it had been on the tip of your tongue, too long, familiar and close, and just slightly out of reach. "I'm working on knowing that," he said. Nathan held his gaze for a long moment, assessing with those serious eyes that had seen too much for their age. Then he nodded once, the same single nod his mother used, the Calloway nod, the one that meant, "I'm going to take what you said at face value and hold you to it," and he went back inside. Agnes put her hand briefly on Eli's arm as she passed him. She didn't say anything. She went inside too. Maggie stayed on the step. The morning was cold and bright around them, the kind of clarity that came after a threat had passed through and left the air scrubbed clean. She was looking at the road where Doss had gone, and her hands were in her coat pockets, and her face was doing the thing it did when she was processing something she hadn't finished processing yet. "Clara," she said. "Was that her name?" "Yes." "He used her to hurt you, right in front of your face."
This story was posted on the channel The
paused.
Rusty Saddle. Please do not
sorry.
repost it in any
It's
form.
not the first time someone's used it. "I know. That doesn't make it less." She turned and looked at him then, and her eyes were the gray-blue they went when she was being completely honest, which was most of the time. "I already knew, Eli. Agnes told me the second week you were here. She thought I deserved to know who was helping me." She said his name with a naturalness that meant she'd been saying it privately for a while and had just stopped pretending she hadn't. "She told me about Clara and the baby, about the marshal's office, about why you left." She held his gaze. "It didn't change a single thing about what I thought of you. I want you to know that." He absorbed this. The fact that she'd known. The fact that she'd known and had never once used it against him or around him, or treated him with the particular careful gentleness people used on the newly fragile. She'd just treated him like a man. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me. It's just accurate." She looked at her hands for a moment. "He said something about the last family that relied on you. He wanted me to doubt you." She looked up. "I don't. I want you to know that too." He was very quiet. The thing in his chest that had been forming for weeks was very close to the surface now, pressing against the inside of his ribs with a persistent reality that was getting harder to explain away as gratitude or purpose or the satisfaction of doing the right thing. "Maggie, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to." He turned his hat in his hands once. The habit of it. "I'm going to say something, and I need you to just let me say it because I've been not saying it for long enough that it started to feel dishonest, and I don't have it in me to be dishonest with you." She went still. Not tense still, the way she went still when something mattered. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "I don't know how to—" He stopped. Tried again. "For 4 years I've known exactly who I was. I was the man who didn't get there in time. That's not a pity. I'm not saying it to make you feel sorry for me. I'm saying it because it was the only identity I had left, and I built everything around it. I moved because men who don't get there in time don't deserve to stay. I worked because men like that don't deserve comfort." He paused. "And then I rode over a rise one night, and I saw you chopping wood in the dark, and your boy was hauling water with arms shaking from the weight, and your little girl was crying quiet so she didn't scare the others." He stopped. His jaw tightened once. "And I couldn't drive past that," he said. "I tried. I told myself it wasn't my business for about 20 minutes, and then I rode back to town and broke into a mercantile and left flour on your doorstep like that was going to be enough. Like I could fix it from a distance and stay safe." He looked at her. "I can't do this from a distance anymore. I've been trying and I can't." The morning was very still around them. Maggie looked at him for a long time. Her expression was not the one he'd feared. It wasn't pity, wasn't the careful management of someone handling an inconvenient confession. It was the look of a woman who had been waiting patient and absolutely still for something to stop being in the distance and come the rest of the way toward her. "I know," she said, quietly, just that. He looked at her. "That's all you're going to say? I've been waiting for you to figure it out." The corner of her mouth moved, just the edge of it. the shape of something that could become a smile if she let it. I didn't want to say it first because I wasn't sure you were ready to hear it, and telling a man who's still deciding whether he deserves to live again that you want him to stay seems unkind until he's made the decision for himself. Eli stared at her. How long have you known? Since the morning you sat at my table and ate beans and cornbread, like it was the finest meal you'd ever had, she said simply. A man doesn't eat a woman's beans and cornbread like that unless something in him has already decided something. He almost laughed. He kept it contained, but it was close. That's your evidence. That and the way you looked at Rose when she pushed the horse toward you, and the way you didn't correct Nathan when he was wrong about the wood grain you just showed him and let him figure out the correction himself. She paused. Men who are passing through don't bother doing it right. He was quiet. The morning sat around them bright and cold and full of the particular quality of air that came after a long winter threat had moved back, not gone, not finished, but retreated enough to breathe. 3 days, he said. 3 days until Winslow. And after that, she said, we'll have time to talk properly. She looked at him with steady eyes. But Eli, whatever you decide when you decide it because you want it. Not because we need you. Not because it's the right thing. She paused. Because I am not going to be anyone's act of redemption. My children are not anyone's second chance at a family they lost. Her voice was gentle, but the words were iron underneath. If you stay because this is where you want to be. If that's not what it is, then what we have right now, this is enough. I mean that. He held her gaze. He held it the way you held a thing that was precious and real and true, without gripping it so hard you crushed it. I hear you, he said. She nodded and went inside. He stood in the yard for a long moment after the door closed. The wind moved through the property, cold and purposeful, bending the dry grass at the fence line, pressing at the canvas panel on the east wall, and finding it solid and unyielding. He thought about Clara. He thought about her the way he'd been trying to learn to think about her, not with guilt, not with the punishing weight of what he hadn't been able to prevent, but with the simple grief of someone who had loved a person and lost her and carried her with him, still and always would. He thought about what Agnes had said that first morning. Dignity. The expensive kind. The kind you paid for with loneliness. Clara had had that. Maggie had it too. Different women, different shapes of courage, but the same bone-deep quality of facing whatever was coming without looking away from it. Clara would not have wanted him to look away either. He thought that standing in the cold yard of a woman's claim in Kansas, 3 days before the thing that would settle whether this family had a future here, and the thought did not make him fall apart. It made him stand up straighter. He picked up the axe he'd set down when Doss arrived. There was still wood to split. There was always something useful to do if you were willing to do it, and Eli Hartwell had always been willing. He swung the axe and the wood split clean, and the sound of it rang out across the property bright and sharp and purposeful in the cold morning air. Inside, he could hear Wesley explaining something to Nathan at great length. He could hear Nathan's short, reluctant responses that meant he was actually interested, but wasn't going to admit it. He could hear below all of that the particular quiet that was Rose, not the broken quiet of the first weeks, but the inhabited quiet of a child who was beginning to feel safe enough to be still. He swung the axe again, and again. The pile grew. On the second evening before Winslow was due, Doss sent a different kind of message. Not men, not documents. He went to Reverend Aldous, and he went to 3 members of the town council, and he went to Gerald Deaver, and by the following morning a petition had been circulated with 14 signatures on it, requesting that Commissioner Winslow be informed of the community's moral concerns regarding the Henderson plot claimant and her living arrangement. Nathan brought the news from town at noon. He'd heard it from the feed store boy who'd heard it from his father who'd signed the petition, and apparently felt no need to keep it quiet. 14 names, Nathan said. Eli looked at the list Nathan had written down from memory. He read through the names. Some of them he'd expected. A few surprised him with their smallness. Gerald Deaver's name sat near the top, which was not a surprise at all. "Does your mother know?" Eli asked. "I told her." "How'd she take it?" Nathan was quiet a moment. "She went outside and stood by the fence for a while. She wasn't crying. She was just—" He paused, looking for the right word. "She was just standing very still." Eli set down the list. He went to the fence. She was still there, standing with her back to the cabin, looking out at the flat winter land, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold. When she heard him, she didn't turn around. 14 people, she said. "Yes. I've lived here for 3 years. I've bought supplies from 3
This
of those
story was
families.
posted on the channel
sat
The
with
Rusty
Helen
Saddle.
Pruitt when she
Please
lost
do
her
not
baby last
repost it in
spring.
any form.
She stopped, breathed. "I know it's DOS behind it. I know it's not real, most of it. It's just—" She pressed her lips together. "It's still 14 people, Eli, who looked at my name on a piece of paper and signed their names next to it." He stood beside her at the fence, and he didn't try to make it smaller or explain it away, because it was real and it was ugly, and she deserved to have someone stand in the ugly reality of it with her instead of trying to redecorate it. "I know," he said. She was quiet. The wind moved between them, and then she turned and looked at him with eyes that were dry and direct and tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "Tell me it's going to matter," she said. "Not the land. I know the land is going to be fine. Tell me after Winslow comes and Doss is done and everything is settled. Tell me my boys are going to grow up in a town where 14 people signed their names next to their mothers, and it didn't break us." He looked at her. At this woman who had held her chin level through months of this, through Deaver's counter and Edna Marsh's whispers, and Doss's men, and falsified documents, and a petition with 14 names, and was still here, still standing, asking not for rescue, but for honesty. "Yes," he said, "it's going to matter, because they'll know their mother didn't move, not an inch." He paused. "And they'll know that's possible, that it can be done, because they watched you do it." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned back toward the cabin. "Supper's in an hour," she said, and her voice was level and warm and utterly ordinary, which was the most extraordinary thing about Maggie Calloway, the way she could be broken open for one moment and whole the next. Not because she was pretending, but because she had decided that whole was what she was going to be. He watched her go inside. From the window, he could see the outline of Nathan at the table, Wesley beside him, and the small, still shape of Rose between them, with her wooden horse held against her chest. One day, until Winslow, he stayed at the fence a moment longer and looked at the 14 names on Nathan's list one more time, and he committed them to memory the way he'd once committed evidence to memory, systematic and precise. Then he folded the paper and put it in his coat pocket and went inside for supper. Harold Winslow arrived on a gray Tuesday morning with a deputy clerk, 2 saddlebags full of territorial documents, and the particular manner of a man who had been doing his job long enough to recognize when someone had been working very hard to get in front of him before he arrived. He was older than Eli had expected, mid-60s, lean with a white mustache, and eyes the color of river water that missed nothing and pretended to miss everything. He came to Agnes Cooper's establishment first, which told Eli that Agnes's letter had done exactly what Agnes had intended it to do. Eli was already there. He had the documents spread on Agnes's big table, Pruitt's testimony, Agnes's signed statement, the provisional claim, the survey receipt, the falsified voiding notice with its impossible date, and the letter from Pruitt's son-in-law confirming delivery and Winslow's response. He had them organized in chronological order with a written summary at the front, because 6 years of marshalling had taught him that the man reviewing evidence appreciated not having to do the organizing himself. Winslow sat down across from Eli, accepted the coffee Agnes set in front of him, without looking away from the documents, and read through everything in complete silence for 12 minutes. Then he looked up. The voiding notice is dated 4 days before the canvas installation you can witness testify to, he said. Yes, sir. And Garfield processed the void? Yes, sir. Has Garfield been approached directly? No, I didn't want him warned before you arrived. Winslow looked at him over the top of the summary page. You were territorial. 6 years. Kansas and the Southern Territory. Why'd you leave? Personal reasons. Winslow held his gaze for a moment with those river-colored eyes that missed nothing. Personal reasons, he repeated, and did not push further, which was the response of a man who understood that some answers were complete, even when they were brief. He set down the papers. Where's the claimant? Her property, 8 miles west. I want to see the land and speak with her directly. He stood, picked up his coffee, finished it in one swallow with the efficiency of a man who'd been drinking field coffee for 40 years. And I want Garfield in my office at 3 o'clock this afternoon. He looked at Agnes. Can you arrange that? I can arrange that, Agnes said, with the tone of a woman who had been waiting to arrange that for 6 years. They rode out to the claim together. Winslow, his deputy clerk, Eli, and Agnes, who had put on her good coat and her expression that meant she was prepared to be formally correct and thoroughly unmovable. Maggie came out to the fence when she heard the horses, and she had put on her good dress too, the dark blue one, and her hair was up, and she held herself with the particular straightness of a woman who understood that this moment mattered and had decided to be exactly herself, in it no more and no less. Winslow dismounted and removed his hat. Mrs. Calloway. Commissioner Winslow. She shook his hand without hesitation, which Eli noticed Winslow notice. I've reviewed the documentation Mr. Hartwell compiled. I have some questions if you're willing. Ask whatever you need to. The children were inside. Eli had asked them that morning to stay in to let their mother handle this part, and all three had agreed Wesley with visible effort Nathan, with the gravity of someone who understood why rose without comment, just a nod, and the wooden horse held a little tighter. Winslow walked the property line with Maggie. He asked about Thomas's original filing about the survey, about when she'd received the voiding notice, and what she'd done with it. He asked about Doss's visits, about the offer of money, about the specific language used. Maggie answered every question with the same quality Eli had come to understand was her defining one precise, unembellished direct. She didn't reach for sympathy, and she didn't minimize, and she didn't perform distress. She just told the truth in the order it had happened. Winslow listened the way good officials listened, when they'd stopped being bad ones, with his full attention and without interrupting. When they came back to the fence, he looked at the cabin, at the canvas panel on the east wall, at the woodpile, the split rails of the new fence section, the kitchen garden plot turned over and ready for spring. He looked at all of it with the eyes of a man reading a story that didn't need to be explained. The voiding notice is fraudulent, he said, not to Maggie specifically, to the situation, to the air between them, to the fact of it. I'll be pulling Garfield's records going back 4 years. This isn't the first claim he's processed under Doss's instruction, and I intend to find out how many there have been. He looked at Maggie directly. Your claim is valid. The filing fee was paid. I found the payment record in the territorial ledger this morning. Garfield removed it from the local record, but hadn't gotten to the territorial copy yet. A pause. Your deed will be complete and in your hands before I leave redemption. Maggie looked at him. She didn't cry, which somehow made it more. Thank you, she said. You did the work, Winslow said. You and the people who stood up for you. He put his hat back on. I'll be speaking with Doss this afternoon as well. He'll be advised that further interference with this property or its occupants will result in territorial-level investigation of his land dealings going back to his arrival in this county. He paused. I don't expect you'll be hearing from him after today. He rode back toward town with his clerk. Agnes followed because Agnes had a front-row seat reserved for the 3 o'clock meeting with Garfield, and she was not going to miss it on any account. Eli stayed. He stood at the fence and looked at the property, the solid canvas wall, the stacked wood, the turned garden, the rope swing moving slow in the November wind, and he thought about the ridge. About the first night he'd sat on his horse up there in the dark and watched a woman chop wood she didn't know how to chop, and made a decision before he'd fully understood he was making it. The door opened. Nathan came out first, which was Nathan's way of checking the situation before letting the younger ones into it. He looked at Eli. "Well, it's settled. The land is yours. The deed will be done before Winslow leaves town." Nathan stood very still for a moment. Then he turned back to the door. "Wes," he called with a steadiness that cost him something, "come out." Wesley exploded through the door like he'd been holding himself in place by sheer will, which he probably had. "Is it done? Is it ours? Did the commissioner—" "It's done," Eli said. Wesley let out a sound that was halfway between a shout and a laugh, and grabbed Nathan by the arm, and Nathan for once did not shake him off. Rose came through the door last quiet, as always, her horse in her hand. She walked out to where Eli stood and stopped in front of him and looked up with her serious eyes and said, "You're staying, Rose." She nodded once, the Calloway nod, the one that meant she'd received the information and found it satisfactory. Then she held up the wooden horse. "You can have it," she said. "For keeps." He crouched down to her level, looked at the small carved horse worn
This story
smooth
was
from
posted
months
on the
of being
channel
held.
The Rusty Saddle. Please do
"That's
not
yours,"
repost it in any
he
form.
said. "I carved it for you." Her eyes went wide, just for a moment, just a flash of it. "You did. That first night. I left it with the flour and the beans." She looked at the horse in her hand. Then she looked at him with the expression of a child who has just connected two things that had been separate in her mind and found that they make a shape she recognizes. "You were there that whole time," she said. "I was there." She put both arms around his neck, sudden and complete the way small children gave hugs when they decided to give them with their whole body and no reservation. He put his hand on her small back and held on. Over her head he saw Maggie standing in the doorway. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. He stayed for supper that night, and the night after, and the night after that, and at some point the staying stopped being notable and became simply the way things were, which was how the right things always happened, not in a single declared moment, but in the accumulation of mornings and meals and small daily choices that added up over time to a life. He moved his things from Agnes's to the claim on a Saturday in late November. Agnes helped him pack with the efficiency of a woman who had been expecting this development and had opinions about how his bedroll should be folded, and she pressed a jar of her blackberry preserves into his hand at the door and said nothing at all, which from Agnes was its own kind of eloquence. Doss had left Redemption 3 days after Winslow's visit. No formal announcement, no forwarding address. He simply was there on Wednesday and gone by Saturday, and the house he'd occupied on the good end of the main road was shuttered and quiet, and the town processed his departure the way small towns process the removal of a long-standing pressure, with a certain stunned relief and a period of not quite knowing what to do with the space where the weight had been. Pete Garfield was removed from his position. The 4 families Doss had displaced through falsified claims were notified by the territorial office, and while the land itself could not in all cases be returned, 2 of the cases resulted in formal settlements. Agnes framed the letter from Winslow's office confirming the outcomes and hung it in her establishment, which she was fully entitled to do. Gerald Deaver did not apologize. Edna Marsh did not apologize. The 14 names on the petition mostly went about their lives as though the petition had never existed, which was exactly what Maggie had expected, and for which she declined to perform surprise or bitterness. Some of them over the following months found reasons to speak to her with more civility than they had before small adjustments. Nothing proclaimed the quiet recalibration of people who had gotten something wrong and were correcting their course without saying so out loud. Maggie accepted these small corrections without ceremony. She was gracious in the particular way that cost nothing, because it required nothing from her, not forgiveness exactly, more like the simple decision to keep moving without carrying it. She had enough to carry. She had 3 children to raise, and a claim to work, and a kitchen garden to get through the ground come April, and a cabin that needed 2 more rooms before summer, because Eli had looked at the single main room one evening and said matter-of-factly that if they were going to do this properly, they were going to need more space. And Maggie had looked at him with those gray-blue eyes and said, "Define properly." And he had said, "I mean, if I'm staying," and she had said, "Are you staying?" And he had said yes, and she had said, "Good 2 rooms minimum." And that had been the whole conversation, and it had been enough. The ceremony was in March, a Sunday, with a circuit preacher who came through on his regular route and seemed pleased to have something to celebrate for once. Agnes stood up with Maggie. Pruitt stood up with Eli. Nathan stood beside his mother through the whole thing with his jaw set, and his eyes bright in a way he would have denied if anyone had mentioned it. Wesley cried openly and seemed completely unbothered by this. Rose wore her good dress and held her wooden horse, and at the moment the preacher said the final words, she leaned against Eli's leg and stayed there. After they ate Agnes's cooking on the long table Eli had built, he'd been building things all winter steadily, and with the care of a man constructing something he intended to last, and Pruitt made a toast that was 3 sentences long and meant everything. And Wesley talked without stopping for 45 consecutive minutes about what kind of horses they should get in spring. And Nathan cleared the dishes without being asked, which was new, and Agnes sat in the corner and watched all of it with the expression of a woman who had done what she set out to do. Later, when the guests had gone, and the children were in bed and the fire had burned low, Eli and Maggie sat on the step of the cabin in the cold March air, the way they had come to sit most evenings, her head finding his shoulder, his arm finding its place around her without either of them having to arrange it. The sky was enormous above them, the flat Kansas dark full of stars, the same stars that had been there all winter, pressing down cold and indifferent on this piece of land, and the family fighting to keep it. "Nathan called you Pa today," Maggie said. "You probably didn't hear it. He said it quietly to Pruitt when he thought no one was listening." She paused. "He said my pa built this table." Eli was still for a moment. The kind of still that happened when something hit the exact center of a thing you'd been protecting. "I heard it," he said. She turned to look at him. "Did you?" "I heard it, and I kept working because I didn't know what to do with it yet." He looked at his hands. The ring on his left hand was plain silver. Nothing complicated, the kind of ring that said what it meant to say without ornamentation. "I've been thinking about Clara," he said. Maggie waited. "Not the way I used to think about her. Not with the weight of it. Just thinking about her." He paused. "I went out to the ridge yesterday morning before you were up. The place where I first watched you that first night." He looked at the dark horizon. "I stood up there and I told her. About you. About the kids. About Nathan calling me Pa even when he thought no one heard." He stopped. "I told her I was going to be all right." Maggie's hand found his. Her fingers laced through his without hesitation, the way they did everything, simply completely, without performing the simplicity of it. "What do you think she'd say?" Maggie asked. He thought about Clara's smile, the one that started in her eyes. He thought about her voice saying, well, Eli, with that weight on the well that always meant she'd figured out what he was going to do before he had. "I think she'd say it took me long enough," he said. Maggie's shoulder shook once against his, not quite a laugh, but the shape of one warm and real and completely her. Smart woman. She was. They sat in the quiet. Inside, through the wall, he could hear Wesley talking in his sleep, which Wesley did regularly and at some length. He could hear the particular silence that was Nathan, who slept as seriously as he did everything. He could hear Rose's breathing slow and even, the breathing of a child who had stopped being afraid of the dark. Sometime around the week, Eli moved his things to the claim and apparently decided with the logical efficiency of a 5-year-old that the dark was no longer a problem worth worrying about. "Rose said something to me today," Maggie said, "while you were out with Pruitt." "What did she say?" "She said." Maggie stopped, and her voice, when she found it again, had a different texture, the particular texture of something that was both ordinary and extraordinary at the same time. She said, "Mama, I think our family is the right size now." He closed his eyes for a moment. The cold air moved around them, and the stars pressed down, brilliant and indifferent and entirely unconcerned with the small human lives arranging themselves beneath them, and below all of it, steady and permanent and real, was the sound of his family breathing inside the walls he'd built. Not the family he'd lost. His family. The one he'd found in the accumulation of mornings in canvas and nails and cold coffee, and a girl who pushed a wooden horse across a table, in a boy who handed him a nail with the warmth of a judge, and ended up teaching him what trust looked like from the inside, in a woman who had stood at a mercantile counter with 43 cents and 3 hungry children, and had not once, not for a single moment, looked down. They had said she was nothing. They had signed their names to a piece of paper and called her shameful and told her she didn't deserve to stay. They had tried to use the worst thing that had ever happened to him as a weapon against the best thing that had happened since. And she had not moved. And he had come back. And the door they had built together, log by log and choice by choice and morning by morning, was solid and true, and painted the deep red of new wood that intended to stand for a long time. "Right size," Eli said. "Right size," Maggie agreed. He pressed a kiss to her hair. She leaned further into him. The stars wheeled overhead in their cold, indifferent brilliance, and the land stretched out in every direction, silent and wide, and belonging finally and completely to the people on this step. Some things broke you open and left you hollow. Some things broke you open and let the light in. Eli Hartwell had spent 4 years learning the difference, and here at the end of it, at the beginning of it, he understood that the difference was not in the breaking. It was in what you chose to fill yourself with after. He had chosen this. This woman, these children, this land, this life. He had chosen it the way you chose the things that mattered, not all at once, not with fanfare, but one quiet morning after another, until choosing became simply being, and being became simply home. And that was the whole of it, and it was enough, and it was everything.